thing. It is a splaying outwards of all the bones. As these bones, essentially the body is trying to fuse these together. The more that disc collapses, the more the body will try to stabilize it by dumping calcium in there. So it's a response really of the body to an instability or lack of proper movement. And so this is going to, the neat thing for me is that helps set in motion then the strategy for actually, how do we actually deal with this, maybe prevent it or try to keep it from getting out of hand, that sort of thing. Okay? So the symptoms that you would have if you're starting to develop arthritis: stiffness in the early morning, stiff after rest or inactivity, right? So this, in general, if you don't move too much and then you try to move and you're stiff and you're sore and you're trying to get your body going. Movement improves the pain, joint crepitus, that means that grinding, the noise in the neck and that sort of thing. So, and it is funny, I think as when I was younger, I didn't pay attention to it, I would just kind of laugh at people, but as we're getting older and as my patients are getting older, we're realizing, you know what, this really isn't the things we heard our parents talking about. We're actually starting to experience that in our lives. We start to realize, wait a minute, I don't like how that is. So the target joints, weight-bearing hips, knees, feet, spine, and also then our hands as well. So it is kind of interesting. So the degeneration causes inflammation, causes pain, joint deformation, and it's more, I think what happens is there's proliferative changes. When the joints start to move improperly, I think the body senses that and says, you don't act like a real joint, so you must not be a joint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix you like I would fix a broken bone. And I think it embarks upon a process that usually takes 10, 15 years trying to solidify that region into a nice, strong, and solid mass of bone, essentially. But what it does is it becomes more and more stiff and it becomes less functional. And so that's something that my strategy, I'm saying, well, wait a minute here. We could either watch that unfold, or we could actually try to preserve as much mobility and flexibility and change the posture and address the issues why those particular areas are wearing out. So, so the question then is the breakdown due to age. And so I guess conceptually, when we talk about arthritis, do we think we're talking about young people or old people?
Usually old.
Usually old people. So. And I think if you were to ask most of us, I mean, the statistics are, I mean, how many people over 65 have arthritis? And it's virtually 100%, right? It's one of those things that is so common that it's almost expected, and it's not that it's blown off, but it's like the doctors, they're not excited by arthritis. It's really interesting. I think they don't want people whining about all their aches and pains. They're tired of hearing about that. They want to save somebody's life or do something dramatic. Arthritis is not one of those dramatic things. Now, I love to help people. I love looking at somebody's gnarly neck or gnarly back and say, is it possible to make this thing function again? Can we allow this person to have a life again and do the things that bring them joy? And to be able to figure a way to get through that gnarledness and really actually rebuild it. So joints are designed for use, right? And the other thing, a lot of times the doctors say, well, if it hurts, then don't do it. Well, that's often the exact wrong thing, because we need to get our joints moving. It's inactivity that is the major problem, so we need to get them moving. And if properly maintained, our joints should last us our entire life. It's not an inevitable process of aging, and we'll look at examples here in the neck about it's only certain joints wear out, and others tend not to wear out. If it were age, they would all wear out.
Right.
It has to be something other than age, right? So anyhow, so that when we start thinking about that, it changes everything when we really think about it. So here's an example of a dear lady. She's now passed away, but it was one of those experiences for me that I will never forget. And it taught me a really important lesson. This dear lady had been a nurse and had worked all her life walking on concrete floors and really had devoted her life to serving mankind. She was starting to have, her back was really causing her problems. And to come to me, that meant she had to go, she was in the Kaiser system, right? So she had to actually pay me, even though she had insurance elsewhere. But the problem was, she had already talked to her doctors. They had already taken x-rays of her back. They couldn't find the cause of her problems. She had done everything that she knew, so that meant she had to go to somebody else and see if we could find the answer. So I took this x-ray. Now, can you see how she has a terrible scoliosis? I measured it at 28 degrees, right? So this is really bad. And if you were a typical medical doctor looking at an old lady, you would say, oh, dearie, you're screwed. I mean, you kind of get the feeling that they kind of blew her off. But what was really interesting is when she was showing me where she was hurting, you know, she was talking about and she would kind of point here. Now understand, when the doctors take an x-ray of the low back, do you realize they just take a picture of the lumbar spine? Right? Do you understand? We do things a little differently. I actually will take an x-ray so I can see your pelvis and your hips. This ended up being the kind of the breakthrough for this lady. Because what I was able to see was a ball and socket that looked like a head of cauliflower here. Even this isn't great, but this was the bad boy. This was, and can you see it's not just a coincidence that it's the way that her spine buckled, and then the cauliflower-looking head of arthritis. This thing's been going for years and years. Well, I got to explain to her, you know what, I think this is really where the pain's coming from. So she gives a call to her doctor. And it's amazing how fast x-rays and CAT scans and things like that can be done when the doctors get a little bit nervous. They missed it. They realized they missed it. So they said, well, we need to schedule immediate surgery. She says, you know what, you guys, when I was coming to you and asking your opinion, you could have found it just by taking an x-ray of my hip going down a little lower. You didn't do it. I went to Dr. Day. He's the one who found it. I'm going to ask him when it's time to have this surgery. And so she comes into me, and she tells me this is what she had told her doctors. And I know they're sweating bullets back there. And I said, well, okay. This has been going on for years anyway. And you're a little bit on the older side of life. It would probably behoove us to spend a little bit of time getting you in better shape. And so I started adjusting her scoliosis and getting things working. And after a couple of months, I mean, her function was better, the pain was still there, but we knew it was going to. We had to get her prepared for the surgery, so I started having her take vitamins and kind of just getting ready for the surgery. She ends up having the surgery, and their doctors, they didn't know what to do with her. She bounced back so fast, it was just one of those glorious things. And, you know, she was so upset with them about how they missed and this chiropractor, and she was an RN. That was, you know, that was the whole thing. It was one of those really marvelous kind of fun things, but for me it was a reminder to make sure if a patient is explaining something, let's make sure we actually do an assessment and actually look. And it really was an arthritic hip that was really at the crux of her problem. Now, if she had been younger, let's say when she came, if she would have come to me when she was 40, before all that cauliflower had formed, right, we could have done some things because she's got the scoliosis and tipping, you know what I mean? There are some other things that we probably could have done to help her, and make sure she wore some orthotics to absorb the shock while she's on these hard floors and things like this. But, you know, so there comes a point that I have to deal with kind of what it is when we start. So anyhow, so that was an exciting thing. So if it's not age, then what would the etiology be? And so what would make this all unfold like this? And so here's my premise is that stress and trauma causes a subluxation that starts a reactive process in your body. And then your innate intelligence, that wonderful mystical part within you that's always monitoring you, and I believe God gave you this ability to heal, and I think it's your body's perception that there's something wrong and it's not acting like a normal joint, that it tries to stabilize this joint because it concludes that it must not be a joint because it's not working right. So, and so here's this will be a little question for you. So, do you think that a joint that moves too much or too little is going to deteriorate more?
Probably too little.
That is exactly right.
Yeah.
Now, what we have, there are studies. Let's say you had a perfectly normal left shoulder, and we put your shoulder in a sling. Do you realize within just a number of weeks, if we were to take that shoulder, that sling off, what would happen to your shoulder? Yeah, and you'd have a frozen shoulder, and it wouldn't work. It would be painful. It would you would have created, by inactivity, created a substantial and significant, what would turn into a nasty arthritic problem just by virtue of inactivity. Okay. And where this comes to play with chiropractic is, I believe there are people whose spines are not working and moving properly